During the ice ages, Earth was inhabited by a huge range of large mammals of many different kinds. They were not cartoon characters, like in certain movies, but real creatures. In North America, places like La Brea tar pits were inhabited by saber-toothed cats, giant mammoths, and ground sloths. Africa was covered by animals that live today, as well as giant extinct giraffes and strange pigs and cattle. Australia had wombats the size of rhinos, and kangaroos twice the size of those alive today. And South America was inhabited by animals that are not only familiar to us, like horses and cats, but also gigantic ground sloths and strange hoof mammals. The whole planet was ruled by gigantic beasts, yet nearly everything that weighed over 100 pounds, or 45 kilograms, disappeared. Yet before 1800, the idea that any animal had ever become extinct was considered unthinkable, a violation of God's benevolence and providence, of the great chain of being, or the fullness of nature. As Alexander Pope wrote, "Who sees the equal eye as God of all, a hero perish or sparrow fall. One step broke, the great scales destroyed from nature's chain. Wherever link you strike, 10 or 10,000th breaks the chain alike." In the late 1790s, Baron Georges Cuvier looked at the fossils of giant mammoths, mastodons, and ground sloths, and considered it impossible that these animals were still alive today or they would have been discovered, and therefore they must be extinct. In 1832, young Charles Darwin on the Beagle voyage collected amazing fossil mammals from South America, which also were clearly extinct. When Darwin wrote up his adventures on the voyage of the Beagle, he said, "It's impossible to reflect on the state of the American continent without astonishment. Formerly it must have swarmed with great monsters. Now we find mere pygmies compared to the antecedent allied races." The co-discoverer of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, wrote, "We live in a zoologically impoverished world, from which all the hugest and fiercest and strangest forms have recently disappeared." If you look at the megaherbivores today, only a few groups like elephants and rhinos still survive, whereas things like ground sloths and giant glyptodons and many others are gone. If you look at the mega predators as well, many of those groups are reduced and very few survive today. Hundreds of papers have been written on the topic, but they boil down to basically four ideas: the effects of humans, called the overkill hypothesis, and then, waggishly, to parallel that construction, the effects of climate over chill, the effects of impact over grill, and the effects of disease, or a global pandemic, sometimes called over ill. Let's look at the effects of climate first. We now know that the ice ages went through about 26 glacial interglacial cycles over the last 2.5 million years. Critics of the climate hypothesis have pointed out that almost none of those other cycles correlated with large mammal extinctions, or only the last one, when humans were present, as a big extinction event. However, it's not as simple as that. The end of the last glacial at 18 to 20,000 years ago, segueing into the modern times around 10,000 years ago, was a very extreme event, especially from an event known as the Younger Dryas event, which occurred around 12,900 years ago. In that short period of time, we now know that there was a gigantic switch back into an ice age in only 10 years. So the last glacial interglacial transition from 12 to 11,000 years ago was not like any of the others, and the Younger Dryas event may be a unique signal. Unlike the termination of any other ice age, a number of specialists in Pleistocene mammals have argued that climate seems to be the most important variable in the equation. We will return to the climate hypothesis at the end of this. A second idea is that a giant object from space arrived at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, triggered the Younger Dryas climate event, and caused a huge mass extinction in land mammals that focused mostly on North America. When this paper was published by Firestone and others in 2007, it indeed had an impact on the profession. The idea started with the famous black mat, an organic rich layer found above the youngest Ice Age fossils at about 50 sites across western North America. The black mat supposedly contained all sorts of impact debris, including Buckminster fullerenes, nanodiamonds, iridium, soot, charcoal, and other supposed impact debris. Eventually, these authors suggested that the impact happened somewhere up in the Laurentide ice sheet, scattering debris all across the southeast part of North America, what is now called the Carolina Bays. These Carolina Bays are rather odd-looking ring-shaped structures scattered in certain areas of the Carolina coastal plain. These ideas were sensational, got a lot of publicity in the science media, and even sometimes entered textbooks. But any scientific idea must withstand the scrutiny of other labs not connected to the original research and produce reproducible results. Sure enough, only 4 years after the original Firestone 2007 paper came out, papers by Pinter, Ishman, and others showed that none of this evidence stood up to the independent scrutiny of other labs. When these independent researchers tried to reproduce the results of the Firestone study, they found there were no microspherules, no iridium, no charcoal or soot, no nanodiamonds, and no Buckminster fullerenes. They were mostly objects of non-impact origin, including even fecal pellets. In addition, such an impact would only affect North American mammals, and it would have no effect on South America or Australia or other regions. Today, the impact model is considered a flashy dead end, although some people are diehards and still try to keep it going. So that takes care of overchill and overgrill. What about another idea, the so-called hyperdisease hypothesis, or over-ill? This is largely the brainchild of mammologist Ross McPhee of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He argues that some kind of plague of some kind of megavirus wiped out the Ice Age mammals. Such an idea sounds promising at first, but if you think about it, how would you test it? Most of the diseases that kill animals leave no trace on the bones that we can see, so it would never leave direct evidence in the fossil record. In addition, there is no known virus or any other disease vector that wipe out entire species and even whole unrelated families of both mammals and birds simultaneously. How would a virus kill off dire wolves but not gray wolves, mountain goats but not their Ice Age counterparts? And as we shall see later in this presentation, the die-off doesn't occur all at once like you'd expect from an epidemic. Nevertheless, other scientists have tried to test this idea. A study published by Kathleen Lyons and co-authors in 2004 showed that in fact there are no examples of extinctions like this. Even something like the West Nile virus, which wiped out many birds in certain islands, did not wipe out all its species and all the individuals. And this does not begin to address the wide variety of different kinds of mammals and birds. In addition, disease did not selectively wipe out just large animals, which is what we find as a pattern at the end of the ice ages. When epidemics occur, they focus on a wide spectrum of body sizes and also on just a few types of animals, not only the largest mammals. So the hyperdisease model remains an interesting but ultimately untestable hypothesis that cannot be checked in the fossil record, and does not explain the actual pattern of extinction of land mammals. The most discussed reason for the Pleistocene extinctions is the so-called overkill model advocated by the late Paul Martin of the University of Arizona. During the 1960s through the 1980s, he was the most famous advocate of the idea that humans, coming in a blitzkrieg from their origin in Eurasia, had killed off most of the megamammals in the Americas and Australia. And indeed, North America, South America, and Australia had the biggest losses of all the areas that were wiped out by Pleistocene extinction, while those in Eurasia and especially Africa had only small losses. At the time Martin proposed these ideas in the 60s and 70s, it appeared that humans had arrived almost exactly at the time that the megamammals had vanished from the Americas and Australia. According to Martin, humans with a unique Clovis point culture were the super hunters who wiped out everything in their path as they spread across the Americas. Martin visualized them as coming in a giant wave as soon as the ice-free corridor emerged when the ice sheets melted back around 11,000 years ago. According to Martin's blitzkrieg overkill model, animals should die out first in northern parts of North America as soon as the humans got through the ice-free corridor, then eventually extinctions would spread across the entire continent. The last regions where extinction should occur would be in South America, especially southern South America. This model depends heavily on the dates of the last megamammal fossils coinciding tightly with the appearance of human hunters. If there's a big age discrepancy between the last appearance of megamammals and humans with Clovis points, then this model of blitzkrieg is falsified. Indeed, that's what the last 20 years of new dates from human sites all across the Americas has shown. There are now good dates from several places in South America going back at least 30,000 and possibly 40,000 years ago, and there were at one time dates as old as 19,000 years at Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania. If the Monteverde site in Chile is indeed 30,000 years old, then humans got all the way to the southern tip of South America before they ever even spread across the inland parts of the continent, possibly by traveling in canoes. But in 2021, startling discovery was made in the white sands of New Mexico, where ancient human footprints dating up to 23,000 years ago were found. Just last year, they were redated and confirmed the original dates of 21 to 23,000 years ago. Then, in 2022, my good friend Tim Rowe and colleagues reported a mastodon butcher site in Colorado that dates back to 37,000 years ago. The evidence of mastodon butchery, the stone tools, and the date are now no longer in dispute, which basically puts humans on the continent at least 22,000 years before the megafaunal extinctions. That pretty much rules out the Blitzkrieg model right there. Combined with sites in South America that may be 48,000 years old, there is no longer any correspondence between human arrival and the extinction of large mammals in the Americas. So old diagrams like this one, which show human arrival coinciding with the extinction of North American mammals, or with South American mammals in these diagrams, are grossly out of date. Some die-hard advocates of the Blitzkrieg model have tried a face-saving maneuver by arguing that only the people who arrived with Clovis points around 11,000 years ago were mega hunters, but this is ad hoc, a desperate attempt at special pleading to salvage their falsified hypothesis. And what about Australia? Studies by Stephen Rowe and his colleagues have shown that the vast majority of the extinctions occurred before the arrival of humans, usually correlate with the big climate events at 125,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, and 80,000 years ago, and only a few die out as humans arrive. Finally, it's a good thing to look back at Eurasia and Africa, which humans have been hunting these creatures for a long time. There's no sign at all that they drove them to extinction, but there is good evidence that some of the extreme climate changes might have done so. Not all of the North American megamammals go extinct around 11,000 years ago. There were mammoths living on Wrangel Island until 4,000 years ago, Irish elk living in Eurasia until 7,000 years ago, American mastodons in North America until 6,000 years ago, and ground sloths surviving on Caribbean islands until about 5,000 years ago. Finally, a study by Hiley et al. In 2009 looked at DNA preserved in permafrost in Alaska. They found evidence of DNA of both horses and mammoths 7,000 years ago, 2,000 years after their last bones had disappeared. This makes you think twice about being too confident about the last appearance of a bone of an animal, when we know they might live on and just not leave a fossil record of bones. So where do we stand? It's probably a combination of both climate change, exacerbated by human hunting on a much smaller scale than the overkill model of Martin and others. The media and the general public prefer simplistic, soundbite answers like humans did it. But in reality, like most scientific questions, the real answer is it's complicated.